Welcome everyone to another episode of Low Brass U Studio Classes, episode 6. And we're going to just get a few things out of the way now. We'll be on Tuesday next week, and we'll be on Thursday the week after that. So just some scheduling issues. But before we get started, we have to bring in this other gentleman.
Hello. Welcome.
Whose shirt you can actually see. My shirt's a little too low for the camera. My camera's
Repping
mounted.
this shirt.
My camera's mounted to the wall more for when I do the other videos. One day this will all be perfectly organized and set up, but today is not that day. Just know that it's definitely a Low Brass U t-shirt. And of course, a Low Brass U mug.
Wow.
Which I'm yet to actually drink coffee in because I don't want to ruin how white and pristine it is right now. So I pretty much only drink water in it, which is a little bit sad, but also it just is what it is.
It's also not really coffee time usually when you're drinking it.
No, yeah, I don't like to have coffee in the evening. Bad things can happen. Every time that I do,
Bad things do happen.
Yeah, things definitely do happen. But cool. Well, let's go ahead and get started. And I figured since, not that everyone, not that the world revolves around Texas. I want to make that very clear. The world does not revolve around Texas. It is one state in the United States, which is one country in the whole world, which is, one planet in the universe, I guess, if we want to keep zooming out.
Wow.
And they're, anyway. Not everything revolves around Texas, but I think this is relevant for everybody. But the reason why we're talking about it maybe does have a little bit to do with Texas. Texas is going to be releasing the all-state etudes for the TMEA, like the larger schools in Texas. And we thought it might be a good idea to just talk about some general practice things for preparing for an audition, some do's and don'ts, some things like that. Do you want to start off, Connor? Because you said you had some story that you wanted to tell.
Sure. Yeah, I've got a couple of stories, not really specific tales of things that I did incorrectly, but I can tell you that I am definitely a decorated expert in auditioning incorrectly. And I remember many times going to, I was in the state of Kentucky. I guess we both were in high school, but in the state of Kentucky, you had to make it into all district before you could audition for the all state and things like that. Oh, that's all right.
I just tested the audio and then I didn't realize my speakers were still on.
All good.
As we say, well, just real quick, as we say every week, we've never had a technical issue. Our streams are always flawless from top to bottom. So, but anyway, continue with your story.
Yes. So I pretty much remember every single time going to all district as a high schooler for that very, very first audition and hearing the audition music for the first time by like the other people in the warm-up gymnasium or wherever they put us.
The cafegimatorium.
Right. I had always been told by, my teachers not to listen to the people in the gymnasium. But sometimes that is a good thing to do because I noticed out of the 100 trombone players, I mean, there probably weren't 100, but for the sake of argument, there were 99 other trombone players. They were all playing certain notes and rhythms that I was not playing. And I heard the music being played correctly for the first time when I was warming up in the gymnasium cafegimatorium for the all district auditions. And this happened every year. And that was because I just didn't read music very well back then in high school. And so I guess my cautionary tale is one of, it's not as much of a problem anymore with people these days that are in school because there are probably a wealth of good audio examples to listen to that you could double check yourself.
Probably not everywhere, but in the state of Texas, generally speaking, that is probably true.
That's probably true in the state of Texas, at least. But I would say don't do what I did. And there should be no notes and rhythms that you were learning for the first time while you are warming up in the audition room. Ask your band director, ask a section leader, ask a trombone teacher or tuba teacher or just a grown-up, that has music literacy and learn the notes because I don't do that correctly a lot. And that's my fun audition story for you guys today.
Yeah, and that can still happen to some extent. I mean, obviously, you have a little bit more music literacy than you probably did at the age of 14.
Somewhat, yes.
But still, those sorts of things can happen where, especially for me when I'm recording a lot of these etudes, there's been occasions where I've played a wrong note or two and didn't realize it. And oftentimes that's a situation where my ear didn't tell me it was wrong. I know with one of the All-State Jazz etudes a couple of years ago, there was like a natural 9, but I played a flat 9 because I didn't carry through an accidental through the bar. And it's like, but it sounded better that way. I thought, So yeah, those are that's definitely a good idea. So yeah, just making sure that you've kind of spent some time and, I like to think about it being a marathon, not a sprint. I think a lot of people are like, once it gets time to do things, start worrying about it a lot. And to me, that's like, you're already too late. Because in general, within reason, nothing is that hard that if you spend enough time with it, with some exceptions of range and things like that, or something that's really fast, but within reason there's a lot of stuff that you can do if you just have enough time with it. So I always think about whether I'm doing a competition or when I was doing all-state stuff, not that I was probably doing this perfectly, but when it comes out, use that time that you have, especially if it comes out over the summer and you're not in school yet. I want to keep on this topic, but I do want to answer this one question real quick. So, favorite JJ solo, do you have one in mind?
Oh man, that's really hard. I mean, my first just like throw it out there answer every time is probably going to be Laura, just because it's so fire. But I need to think about that a lot longer, because that's probably the first solo that really, really grabbed my attention. I don't know if it's like necessarily my favorite J.J. Johnson solo in general, but
I think one of mine might be I Love You off of the album Vivian, if you know that one. Mm-hmm. I think he plays it in A, is that right?
That sounds correct.
I think that's right. I know it's not the standard key, but I'm pretty sure that not standard key is the key of A. But yeah.
Oh, that makes me think of a better one. I can't think. What's the album where he does Our Love Is Here to Stay? And he does it in A flat, and it sounds like he's playing a valve trombone the whole time, because he's really just leaning super hard into that sort of like doodle valve half step ornament sort of thing.
I'm looking it up. I don't know off the top of my head.
That's a great solo. It's a really, really stylized one, but it's just masterful. And you would
blue trombone.
That's on Blue Trombone. There you go. That's a great one. That's another good solo too.
Yeah.
On that tune, Blue Trombone. That's like, if you want to get your bebop language together on the trombone, just go as far as you possibly can transcribing Blue Trombone and try to memorize it, because none of it's like super chopsy, none of it's super high, none of it's super fast. It's all just really, really good language. That was something back in the old days when I was responsible for jazz trombone fundamentals. That was like one of the games that we played at the very end of the year, which is like we all saw how far we could get into Blue Trombone transcription in like a week or two. It was a lot of fun.
I wonder what that class would have been like if I would have taken it from a grad student when I was a freshman, before you were there, because I was always taught by a faculty member at that time.
Right. It's probably a lot different. There's something to be said about learning something, specifically like devices about how to play the jazz trombone, from somebody who just learned it themselves.
Yeah, just figured it. It's like, hey, I finally have the answers, let me tell you.
That's a real thing in education. They call that the zone of proximal development. And so it's something that you should do, and it would be a great coupling for anyone who's taking, well, at that time, you wouldn't have private jazz trombone lessons with a professor, would you? If you're a freshman.
No.
In that degree program. Well, either way, it's cool. I think it's an interesting way to kind of break into that sort of field of study. I think it's an interesting perspective that you wouldn't get otherwise at maybe at a smaller college. So,
well, that way of teaching it's also kind of like mirrored in skydiving teaching. Do you know about this in skydiving teaching, where like when you start being like the person who's taking people, you don't take the like complete novice because they're the biggest liability. You take someone who's like just a notch below you, and like because probably, you know, like they're able to like handle themselves almost anyway, and then you're just like a little bit of help, but they're not going to do anything just like really, really stupid. Whereas like a first timer might do something just like completely crazy, you know, and just like have no idea. So yeah, it's kind of a fun thing. Brian also asks, have you ever had a lesson with Doug Elliott? Thoughts on his pedagogy or mouthpieces? I have not. I haven't really dealt with him at all. I mean, I know who he is. I know about his mouthpieces. Neither of us have owned a mouthpiece from him, right? You haven't owned one?
No, I have not.
Yeah, I'm not against them. I know a lot of people who do, but I don't know. It's never been so easy for me to like try them. It's not like they're not anywhere, but it's like I've never had that like, here are all the parts and figure out which one's best for you when I was like looking for a mouthpiece or something.
Right.
And I don't really know about his teaching either. I don't know.
No, I couldn't cite anything specific. I'd like to learn more.
Yeah, I mean, I think he has a good, I think his name carries some weight in the industry, but I don't know quite as, because he's like retired military, right?
That sounds correct.
I think he's over there.
There you have it.
But yeah,
more research is needed.
Right. Yeah. Sorry, we don't have all the answers. And as I always like to say, if someone tells you that they have all the answers, they probably in actuality do not. But I won't even say that I have or Connor has. I'll speak for you in that regard, Connor. That
I appreciate that.
Neither of us have all of the answers. But yeah, so maybe going back a little bit to the all-state audition prep sort of stuff. When I'm working on something, especially something that's pretty difficult for me, I like to practice at like half tempo for like, especially with something like All-State where, it's going to come out for Texas. I know we don't want to make this all about Texas, but it's going to come out next week for some Texas people, and you're not going to have to play it for anyone. Maybe your auditions for your band program, but probably not the whole thing or not every etude. You've got time. Time is on your side. And the worst thing that you can do from my vantage point is play it fast with just like a ton of mistakes.
Right.
And I think that that's everyone's first instinct. That's not you as a high school student, that's not you as a middle school student, that's not you as a college student, it's not you as a professional. That's like everyone's first instinct.
Right. It's fun to do.
Just jump right in. I'm guilty of it all the time, especially when I'm doing all these etude videos and they're like books that I know or kind of know, and then it's like, oh, I know this, and I'm just like, oh, it says Allegro, sure, let's do Allegro, and then it's just like you get like halfway down, so it's like, oh, I didn't see that there were 16th notes, I can't do this right now, and then it's like you stop and you just take a step back. But I think that that's a big thing that you want to make sure that you're doing or not doing, is you want to be practicing slowly right from the start, making sure that I always go back to that story from my first trombone teacher of you want to play it perfectly, even if that means that it's really slowly or it's down the octave or it's up the octave. I think that that's an underrated thing, probably a little less relevant for tenor trombone and for euphonium, but especially on tuba and bass trombone, some of it you should be playing up the octave to make it easier.
Absolutely. Makes a lot of sense. Hey, DJ.
How's it going, DJ?
Oh, it's good to see you.
Welcome to the stream. I think you've been on like one or two other streams so far, if I remember correctly. But yeah, good to see you. And you're back in Texas, I believe. Not to dox you, I guess, but you don't have to answer that. You're somewhere in the world if you don't want to admit to that. So let's see. Brian says, have you found Thayer's to be a turnoff for improv on bass bone? What about dependent valves? You want to take this one, Connor? You
You want to hear my hot take on Thayer valves on a bass trombone
as it pertains to improvisation?
Yeah, that's another one of those, like, man, if I had ever had any experience improvising on a bass trombone with Thayer valves, I'd be the first to let you know. I can say that I probably have more of an interest and maybe some working knowledge of improvising in the valve register than the average bear. Like, that's something that
you do.
Just in our friendship, Zach and I have experimented with because of the musicians that we like to listen to and the music that we enjoy. It's definitely something that we riff about a lot. I can't speak to the difference in the valves and how they like function or relate to anything other than it's a ton of fun. Zach would probably have a little bit more knowledge on this topic.
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely like a pretty narrow topic just in general. It's like there are only so many people that are improvising on bass trombone, and probably
right, like my only thought is like, what does Reggie Chapman use? That's all I can think of. Or Chris Glassman, what does he use?
I don't know what he uses off the top of my head. It's like I've heard him more than I've seen him.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think ultimately when someone decides that they want to improvise on bass trombone, they probably improvise on the bass trombone that they have, which is whatever they may have. If I had, 10 bass trombones to choose from, which ones would I go with for improvisation? I do think that I kind of would prefer rotor valves. I think that that's, I can't swear to that necessarily, but it just feels like that. I don't have a good reason. I wish I could more eloquently tell you why, but I also haven't done enough, research into it to kind of like actually give a formed opinion. With dependent valves, again, it depends on how you use the instrument. But yeah, I don't know that I mean, I'm an independent player. I don't really ever think to change. I mean, maybe I'd like to try that for science a little bit, like especially with this channel. Like, I think that could be kind of a fun thing if independent bass trombone player plays dependent and see for a month and let's find out what happens. And I know it won't be that exciting of an answer, but there are pros and cons to both sides. What I will say with independent valves in regards to improvisation is it's another option. To me, and this is again coming from the vantage point of being someone who plays an independent bass trombone and has only owned an independent bass trombone, and even before I owned one, that's all I played. Like, that's what my high school had. All of my life has been on an independent bass trombone. But it's more, to me, it's more options. There are more options on an independent bass trombone than there are on a dependent bass trombone. There are some benefits of dependent bass trombones. From my vantage point, I see it more as from a theoretical tone perspective, and that when you're using the open horn, it's only going through one valve, even though it's open. So that theoretically should make it be a little less stuffy and things like that.
That's on the dependent?
Yes. So
okay.
In my eyes, theoretically, a dependent sounds better. But it's like that. I think that it's splitting hairs, and that's probably not necessarily a reality thing. But there is some logistical thought that I think makes sense with that. But yeah, so I think for me, it's just another option. Do I use my second valve alone when I'm improvising? Almost never. It's like if I go down there, unless I'm playing a B, like a low B, I'm not using the second valve at all, just because for me to not have to think, which is what theoretically when you're improvising, you don't really want to have to think about it. And, that's the sort of thing that I don't really have to think if I'm just using the first valve. If I'm using the second valve, maybe I don't have to if I'm playing certain things, but I don't know.
It would be nice to pick the brain of somebody who is like a really like one of these gifted improvisers that we're talking about that has like a much more maybe like instinctive or implicit knowledge and memory of how both the valves work that truly improvises with those two. I feel like at the crux of it, having the independent valves would sort of align someone with the philosophy, or I guess it would be easier to say the dependent valves. I feel like the function and the benefit of the dependent valves kind of puts you in like a slide first sort of headspace and philosophy when you're navigating the bass trombone. It's like I am playing an instrument with a slide, and I can engage these valves as tools to activate new slides, as opposed to like kind of thinking about them as a series of valve combinations.
Yeah, I think that the person that I would think about to ask these sorts of questions to would probably be Reggie Chapman. I'm sure if you hit him up and you could try to get a lesson with him, because one of the things that he kind of talked to me about, because we did Disney together, like 8 years ago now or something. But he was like writing his like dissertation or thinking about, I'm not exactly sure what stage he was in at that point, but he was kind of thinking as the bass trombone being a trombone in B flat, no valves, a trombone in F, a trombone in G flat, and a trombone in D, kind of like how you see it printed on like on woodwind brasswind, where it's like B flat / F / G flat / D, thinking about it literally that way. And if you watch like his videos of like brass scene kids, you can see some of the things of him kind of doing those sorts of things and going back and forth. So I think that dependent to me kind of comes from the reality of like most bass trombone players are taught by a tenor trombonist, especially like 30 years ago. And it's that sort of like teaching that leads you to go slide first when it's maybe not the right way to do it. It's like, I think that especially in improvisation with a lower brass instrument where we're already kind of like with a handicap, I shouldn't think about it that way, but like there's a reality that like certain things are easier to do on the saxophone. I think we can all agree to that. And so using any trick that you might have, I think is really good. So let's answer some. I mean, not all these are questions, but I am curious because DJ says he's going to UNT. Does that mean a DMA? Does that mean a performance cert or something? I'm curious as to what that means. And then Chris uses Indy Hagman's Tyne Universal. Sorry, I know what it is, but reading is hard. Tyne Universal. Only big improviser I can think of that uses Thayers is Dave Taylor, but he played rotors on his whole. Yeah. I mean, I think that there's a lot of trends too. It's like Thayers, like 90s into the early 2000s, and even to now, it's like that was like everyone had to switch. It's like it's so much more open. It's so much better. And nowadays, I feel like it's still very popular. Don't get me wrong, but it's not like this is the only way to do it. But right. I know with Reggie, he did play in Edwards. But now he plays on the BAC, which is, I think that they use the Meinl-Schmidt open flow valve on that. Don't quote me on that. But definitely a more rotor based, not an axial flow or Thayer sort of valve. Master's degree in jazz composition and arranging. Interesting.
Nice. They're lucky to have you.
So let's answer as if we just like have the answer, but let's think about DJ's question. Do you all think post-COVID music programs might finally start focusing less on competition UIL results and more on musical development, or do you think development should fall on lesson teachers? So I'm, thinking about that from, the perspective of Texas, as DJ is from Texas and spent most of his life in Texas and probably has taught a ton in Texas. I don't think things are changing. I would say where you think things are, I think have been. I think that's where they will be, if I had to guess, as far as those sorts of things. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you have some thoughts, Connor, from your perspective.
I mean, I would say that if I was a band director or an administrator in the Texas school systems looking kind of from the inside out at the system, which I am not, but I imagine looking at all the variables, they would say that the argument would be made that UIL and competitions and the larger kind of infrastructure of the Texas band scene is the development of the student. And their counter question would be, what's a more equitable way to get development out of this many students all at once? Now, like, is it perfect? Is it deeply personal? Is it catered to the identity or the individual needs of every single learner? Logistically, that's hard to do, even in a pretty project-based specialized learning environment. But I would say that would be I'm not a for or against it. I would just say that would probably be the counter argument, is that, like, and you can say the same thing about like competitive marching band. You could say this is a lot of resources. It's a lot of time. It's a big commitment outside of core academic blocks. Sometimes it costs some schools some money, it costs families some money, to which the counter argument would be, well, this is like, from an equity measure, we have tons of students that can be in marching band all at once. It's a huge class size. Inclusion, as far as like SPED students, ELL, mobility, pretty much anybody can engage and be a part of the marching band thing. The only really good like counter program that's like analogous that I've seen or talked about, and this is like going like back 10 years to like education classes where I read about this in like an article, was steel band programs. And the thing that I was reading about was steel band programs in schools in West Virginia that didn't have the resources or the money to actually build a marching band program. And it was like kind of like pound for pound, you could get as many students engaging with music through the steel band as you could with a marching band, but maybe like the costs were less. And that was kind of that was another argument that might be on your side of like, we could be doing this for cheaper and having more students engaging in music, if that's the argument. But I don't know. That's a long way to say. It's kind of a complicated issue, but I totally know what you're saying, where like you can lose so many students in the weeds with any sort of system that's that big, especially something that's competition based.
Right. I think ultimately, like the analogy that I always think about is UIL or competition sort of stuff with music is just standardized testing. It's like, to say that we shouldn't be doing that, I feel like you would have to say we shouldn't be doing standardized testing, and or maybe not that quite that simple, but there's definitely a correlation between those sorts of things of teaching to the test, which is, it seems like DJ's more taking the stance that you shouldn't teach towards the test. You should be working on getting better, and and I don't necessarily disagree, but I think that that's ultimately the education system, at least in this country, is by and large teaching to the test, being, standardized testing, being the ACT, the SAT, being UIL, whatever it may be. There's a lot of teaching towards the test, which in teaching towards the test, that's not to say that you can't be learning and you can't like apply those things to, greater effect in your life, or in your schooling, or however you want to think about it. But I think that that's ultimately what's kind of going on with a UIL sort of thing, is that it's teaching towards the test. And I think that getting people to teach less towards the test seems unlikely from my vantage point.
Right.
I'm not a superintendent of a school district or something.
Yeah.
I've never taught, full time. I've taught lessons, but I haven't taught, classroom setting in a school system, nor do I have any immediate plans to do so.
It's an interesting perspective, though, kind of thinking about like maybe there is some sort of ideological shift or some sort of bias that might take place, like in a school system or a state like Texas that has such big competitions and UIL and things like that, and also has really, really healthy, or at least like really prolific private lessons systems in place in a lot of schools. And I know, as someone who grew up in a different state that very much is an outsider looking in, like lots of other states and band programs are very envious of the fact that Texas schools have this great way of, just got lots of private lessons for a lot of kids, and they make it happen somehow. And it's really, really cool. But maybe, and I don't know, this is probably not the case for every band director, it highly likely is not, but it would be easy for me if I were a stressed out band director that had all these things and expectations for what my ensemble was doing at a macro administrative level, thinking like, oh, the kids will figure out, what they like about music. They got the private lesson teacher. It's fine. They'll do a fun piece with them. It's easy. So maybe some of the it would be easy for me if I was a band director that was pressed for time to get UIL stuff. Like if I was thinking about the social emotional learning needs of my students, I might have to rely maybe sometimes heavily on trusting that those one-to-one relationships with private lesson teachers were satisfactory for my kiddos. So that's another element to it.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, it's a deep question.
That's a good question,
to say the least. I hope that in a lot of ways, past this global situation that we were in and still are in and are dealing with getting out of and all that sort of stuff, I hope that we can take the good and disregard the bad, in a very macro sense. But I think in music and stuff, there is some benefit to that. I think we all know how to use a microphone a little bit better now. I think we all know a few more things that I think will become more relevant. And I think that, doing projects and things remotely now is easier than ever. It's like for like the All-State Jazz Etudes for Texas, I had people record play-along tracks, and it's like, could those people have done it before? Probably. But it was just like their setups were just well-oiled machines. It was like they were able to just do it so easily because that's all they had been doing for the last year, instead of like, oh yeah, let me like get my setup back set up and like let me see if my snare drum mic's in the right spot. It's like, no, it's all set up, ready to go. So in a general sense, I hope that a lot of the things that we've learned, stick with us and we are able to continue doing them or add them to what we're doing in some way. And again, hopefully there's some change for good. I think that just with the UIL thing specifically, it's just you're so deep into a system at some point, and it's not just Texas that is like this. I think that's an important thing to make a distinction.
Yeah, that's true.
I think that like in my personal high school program, we were less concerned with those sorts of things. But, we probably didn't play those things as well sometimes, but we got through a lot more music than a lot of other programs did. And for me, that was really beneficial to me. I felt like I played more repertoire in high school than I did in college. And that's just because it was just consistently thrown at me. And like there were times in college where it's like a piece would come up and I was just like, yeah, I don't know that I know this one. It's like, oh yeah, I've already played this like a couple of times. I just like didn't, it just was all going by so fast and I was so young and I didn't, probably didn't take it as seriously in some ways. But that's kind of, I think that there's a lot of good that can be done from that perspective of just getting through some things and doing some different things and not always thinking about what's on this standardized list of music and what will get my boss to notice me by getting this, standardized thing. But I think you have to realize at some level it's like, well, if you want to get promoted or you want to get a raise, how do you think you're going to do that? It's like, well, you're probably going to get good ratings at something like that. And that's how your boss, who maybe doesn't understand exactly what your job is and what you do, it's ultimately it's an imperfect way, but it's one of the only ways that we're set up to really evaluate those sorts of jobs at this point. I know there are other ways and there are other factors and things, but I think that's an important kind of thing to think about with this. And yeah, I don't know that I think it's going away. But yeah, definitely a good question. I want to get a little bit to, I don't know if Brian's still on here, but talking a little bit about Reggie. So for those who don't know, we're talking about Reggie or Reginald Chapman. He uses his valves outside of the valve register, as we put it. So what Brian is talking about, and what we kind of alluded to earlier with Reggie, is that he's thinking about each key of the bass trombone being a different instrument, and why shouldn't you use them in whatever range? And especially from an improvisation standpoint, if you're already here and you can just put this valve down and go here, and that allows you to do something that, especially on the bass trombone, there are times where you really have to use your valves in the staff and things like that. Like one very specific example that's just like always it's my go-to example for something like that is there in Drew Zarimba's Race to the Finish, the fourth of 5 trombone parts, that there's all this stuff in the staff and it's so fast that I don't believe you could play it on a dependent bass trombone, not cleanly. Like you need to have, because it's a bunch of flats, so you need to be able to use that second valve alone in the staff, and it's not a valve note necessarily. Like, yes, you can play that D flat elsewhere, but there's just a reality to efficiency of movement. That's why a lot of jazz trombone players, like tenor trombone players, play in the high range, because if you play, if you play high enough, we only need the first 3 positions, basically, right?
Right.
It's like once you get past, B natural, everything is in the first 3 positions, basically.
Right. You're good. You're good to go.
So it's, at that point you can get from any note to any note, obviously not as fast as someone doing this, but pretty darn close. So I think that thinking about it in that way with the bass trombone and using those sorts of things, I think that that's something that could be really beneficial. I think if I had spent more time, I think I improvise on bass trombone, but probably 95% of my improvisation on bass trombone is in performance, and probably 5% is in practice.
Definitely.
And I guess my point is I'm using my tenor trombone brain and putting like a translation layer on it, and not necessarily thinking about it from probably the way I'd like to, but also improvising on bass trombone, especially when I don't have a bass trombone in my hands on most of my gigs. It's been a while at this point since I played bass trombone on a gig, but I think that if that's what you're, again, we don't know everything about you, Brian, but I know you've definitely asked a lot of bass trombone-centric questions. One might assume that is your primary instrument. And if that's something you're thinking about doing, I think using those, and again, I guess we don't know what instrument you're playing on, but if you're playing on an independent horn, I think using that to its fullest potential, I think is really powerful. Because I think what a lot of times happens is bass trombone players are like, I want to start improvising, and then they only play in the tenor range, and then they start playing tenor trombone, and then that's it,
Right. It's like, what resources would you give to a bass trombonist if you were like, hey, go learn how to improvise? Even if you give them something trombone specific, like you could give them like the David Baker, like contemporary practices for jazz trombone books, and those are all going to say things that are generally, well, those are actually good because it's like a lot of shapes and patterns. And then like there's kind of this caveat when you learn it, it's like play it in all registers. But the assumption, especially for like how example like 1A is like notated, is usually like around middle C, or like somewhere where it just makes sense to do something trombonistically on, like the straight horn is kind of implied in most jazz trombone pedagogy.
Yeah, and I think that at the end of the day, it's like if you're, even with tenor trombone to some extent, but definitely with bass trombone, it's been done before at this point, like improvising on bass trombone, but I think it's very important to say that like you're kind of still on your own. Like I wouldn't say that there's a very clear pedagogical path of what you should be practicing, how you should be practicing it, who should you be transcribing, and a lot of this stuff, there's not a perfect path for any instrument necessarily. But it's like, do you transcribe trombone players and play it down the octave? Do you just transcribe all Bill Reichenbach solos and call it a day? Do you transcribe bass solos? Do you transcribe Barry sax solos? Probably the correct answer is yes, all of that.
Yes, yeah.
And trumpet players and alto players, tenor players, piano players, all of that too, which we kind of, probably all are relatively aware of that if you're in the kind of jazz world. But I think that's something to kind of think about, is you kind of have to figure out how to make it work on your instrument. Like I think that's and maybe you change to a different setup for that purpose or something. But especially low brass instruments, they're so expensive. I always just with my students, it's like, oh yeah, it's like this one thing is hard. It's like, oh, I wish I had piston valves in my tuba. Oh, this one thing is hard. I wish I had rotor valves. Oh, I wish I had dependent. I wish I had independent. I wish I had a Thayer valve. I wish I had a rotor. It's like, yeah, they all have advantages. And your options are to spend all of the monies and buy all of the brass instruments and use the exact right one for the exact right situation. But even then, it's not a perfect situation. I'm fortunate to have, we're both fortunate in having more than one horn, we'll put it that way.
Right.
We both have a few horns. But what if, what if in your situation, Connor, you bring your Edwards but you consider your King 2B to be your lead horn, and then you show up to a big band thing and they're like, oh, you're playing lead, then you're like, oh, I would have brought another horn. What, do you go home and not play the gig?
Right. No, I mean, that happens all the time. And especially if you get called like I do to play a lot of third trombone, be expected just get ready to play some lead on whatever you have. And it's like, they're going to pass you a chart and it will be fine. And I don't bring two horns just in case someone asks me to play a lead trombone. It's like maybe the 2B might cut a little bit better, but it's never bothered anybody before. So even if it is incorrect, I'm just going to keep doing it.
And, different situations call for different solutions too.
Sure.
You might say that you only bring one. Let's say that you have a recording date. Would you only bring one? If you were a little unsure?
It depends.
And it was really important.
Yeah, I'd bring them both, and I'd bring the Edwards, or not the Edwards, rather the Block 42.
Yeah, large bore with a valve. I mean, that's what I do whenever I have a recording date. It's like I bring probably double the amount of instruments that I was told to bring, because you just don't know what's going to happen in there. It might even be that, yes, that was what you're supposed to do. It's like, oh, hey, can you do this? Can you overdub this other thing too? So I guess my point is, long-winded answer, but you have to deal with the instrument that you have, and if you're in the market for something different, maybe you take these things into consideration. But at the end of the day, it's like you have to, I would love to have a smaller C tuba right now, because I record my videos in a small room and my 6-quarter C tuba is way too big for this room, and I have to walk on eggshells when I'm playing it, and it's not ideal. That being said, when I go out in the real world, I like having that instrument, so I'm not going to sell it. And to get a smaller C tuba like what I want, I'd have to spend at least $7,000. I don't want to spend $7,000 on that right now. So you make your solution work. Maybe you change mouthpieces, maybe you do this, maybe you do that. So it's just kind of ultimately how you deal with it. Elvis said, sorry. What?
Before we get away from that, I have a funny story that I kind of want to share about bringing the right instrument for the job. And I think the farther away you get from something really structured, like a school band, you always have to be careful and be really, really as specific as possible when asking what instrument people actually want you to play, because trombone can mean a lot of different things. And I remember one time being asked to play, it was a lot of pre-bop, 1910s and 20s sort of tunes, traditional gig. And they asked me to play trombone, and I got there for the rehearsal. Luckily, there was a rehearsal for this one, and there was another person with a trombone, and this was a 6-piece, 7-piece band. It's probably not supposed to be 2 trombones. And I get my horn out of the case. They're like, oh, we thought you played saxophone. I was like, no. And there had been some sort of miscommunication between the person that called me, and it worked out fine. It ended up being a bunch of Sidney Bechet tunes. And it's I don't play soprano sax. So I just ended up having to do the gig on trumpet. And it ended up being fine. It worked out really well. The band sounded awesome. The Billy Goat Strut Review, if you're familiar with them, the Louisville group. And Allison Cross was the trombone player. Oh. Fantastic trombone player. I love Allison. So yeah, it was great. But definitely ask very specifically. And there's been lots of times where especially when you get away from big band and you're talking to rockers, it's sometimes trumpet means trombone, You know, like sometimes it's good to
Brass
like
means saxophone. Like,
things can happen. So be careful.
yeah, I always try to ask as many questions, and then I hate to say this, but I assume they don't really know what they're talking about. And like an example of that would be, I had this recording session, and it was for like a country rock artist that I'd recorded for once before, and I got hired to play. Like, I was told, like, we want someone to play baritone. And I was like, you know, of course, I'm like, well, I don't have a baritone, I have a euphonium. You know, I didn't say anything like that. But, you know, it's like, I'm like, I don't know that you know what that, because it was a saxophone player, and I don't know him super well. I mean, he's a good saxophone player, but sometimes people don't know about other instruments. And it just felt really weird that someone wanted me to play baritone / euphonium on a country rock album sort of thing.
It can happen.
And that's exactly what it was, but I didn't know, I didn't get the parts ahead of time. It was show up to the studio, you know, here's the address, and I'll bring the parts for you. So I brought a tuba with me because I don't trust people to know the effective range of that instrument. I thought there was a decent chance that I'd get there, and it's just like, oh, this is too low. Not that I couldn't play it on euphonium, but it'll sound better on tuba. And especially for me, being a multi-instrumentalist person, it's like, no, I ask a lot of I make sure. Because, like, oh, here's this brass quintet gig. No other information. It's just like, I need more information.
Right.
Like, do you want me to play tenor trombone? Do you want me to play tuba? Do you want me to play bass trombone? Do you want me to play both bass trombone and tuba? It's like there are essentially 4 different scenarios that could happen.
Right.
Ultimately, you know, making sure that you have the right instrument is something that you can try for, but you might not always succeed. But I do want to get to Elvis's comment. Personally, Elvis is a bass trombone player primarily, and says, personally, I like using the F valve for sustains and the G flat valve for runs. That's interesting. I've never thought about it in that regard. I guess for me personally, I've been thinking about making a video about this, but I have to like organize my thoughts in a clear way. But I have like a hierarchy of what I want to do valve wise, and then the real world happens, and you have to figure out the best way to do it. But ultimately, my kind of thinking is, from a tone perspective, using the slide is your best option. So if you're playing a low F, play it in 6th. Assuming that your arms are long enough and that's comfortable and everything. For me, it is. You know, I know for everyone, it's not. Anything like that. Like, I'll play Bs out in 7th. I'll play, you know, especially if it's a sustain. I'll do that. Obviously, at some point, you run out of slide, and then at that point, I would prefer to use the shorter of the 2 valves, especially in a situation where I don't necessarily. I don't like playing things in first position if I don't have to, in the low range especially.
Yeah.
With valves and things, it's like, yeah, I tuned my valves, but
right. Things happen.
Did I tune them today? Are they warm? Like, have I been using them? So I'd rather have the freedom to make an adjustment. You can't see my other hand. Make an adjustment with the slide while I'm playing. So I would much rather prefer to play like a, you know, I already said that I want to play it in 7th, but you know, like a low E. If I can't play it in 7th or it's inefficient, I would rather play it. Or I guess a better example, is like a C or an F. Playing that with the 2nd valve in, you know, a modified 2nd position. To me, that's preferable than playing it in first position all the way in and hoping for the best.
Right.
Because if you're flat, what do?
Ruh-roh.
You stay flat.
Now, I have a question.
Okay.
Outside of like the first position, like you can flat it but you can't sharp it conundrum, like what when we prioritize the straight horn, or we prioritize like going as little into like valve combinations as possible, is the horn actually more resonant as a straight horn, or is it just like the simple fact of like I've probably done more long tones on an open F in 6th position than I have in some sort of double valve combination that might work?
I mean, I don't think that there's a simple answer to that. My thinking is just basically that the valves are extra turns that we don't want.
That makes enough sense. So like strictly, like, even if you like were like, I am Captain Valve, I am so comfortable with all resonating zones, I know where all my happy spots are. It's just like the simple fact of like the air bends less, it's going to be more stable. Like that's kind of the science behind it.
That's at least my belief. I think it very much does depend on what instrument you play also. You know, woe is me, I don't have the world's greatest bass trombone. I have a good bass trombone, but not the world's greatest bass trombone with not the world's greatest valves. And there are certain little things that I feel like I have to do that I don't have to do whenever I play someone's, you know, more modern bass trombone, even from the same company. You know, I have a Bach, but I have an older Bach with older valves that are smaller than what you'd find on most modern instruments from Bach, Edwards, or whoever. And so I think that they're, you know, using the valve or not using the valve in the right situation is almost a moot point. But that's not necessarily everyone's situation. But I think in a vacuum, it's better to use the slide. Ultimately, we want to get the valves to sound just as good, and that's like another thing that we want to practice. But I believe in the slide a little bit more than I do the valves. And you know, DJ Rice is saying Jimmy Clark always advocated for using normal slide positions instead of the trigger first or whatever, unless you absolutely needed to. Yeah, and that's kind of, you know, again, my thinking is that sometimes you do need to. That's just a reality of it. You know, there's.
Right.
But kind of going back to my hierarchy of why I use what slide positions. So, you know, that's if I'm sustaining a note, I think that properly explains what I'm after. Once it gets a little bit further out with the second trigger, like around E flat, that's where I probably switch to the first trigger. And that's mostly just because I know exactly where low E flat is with the first trigger, and with the second trigger, I'm pretty sure I know where it is. I do know where it is. And like, even, you know, I mean, I say that, but like in one of the All-State Jazz videos for this year, I used second trigger E flat to end the etude on a pedal E flat. So I do use it, but my kind of, I'm very sure, especially being a little bit more on the tenor trombone side of things, I'm very sure of where things are with the first valve, and it depends on how much bass trombone I'm playing. There are times where it's like, and right now I'm on the up and up. It's like I've been playing a lot of bass trombone recently. I feel pretty confident, but I could go 6 months without playing a bass trombone. It wouldn't affect me professionally at all. You know.
Yeah.
And I don't usually do that, but you know, sometimes we get to like 6 weeks and it's like, oh, I should have probably gotten that out.
Right.
But anyway, but then, you know, from there, when do we use what valve? I think a lot of it has to be of efficiency of motion, and I think that depends a lot on the type of music that you're playing. You know, a lot of bass trombone stuff, especially in orchestra, it's not that bass trombone-y. You know, it's third trombone, not necessarily bass trombone. I think that there are lots of times where you don't even need a valve. You could just have a straight bass trombone and you'd be just fine. And some big band music, it's like, yeah, you're not playing a single note that you need a valve, especially like you're playing some bassy stuff before like the bass trombone was really a big thing. Some of that doesn't have any like real low notes in it where you need valves. Some modern stuff, it's like, good luck. This isn't playable. Do your best.
Right. This is so hard.
And so in that way, when I'm kind of faced with those sorts of challenges of maybe it's not impossible, but it's flirting with that sort of like, it's pretty hard, you know, and I can't just like, oh, I want to only use the open slide. That's the perfect choice. It's like, no, the perfect choice is what works. And when you start playing faster, I try to think about where certain notes are. I'm trying to think of a really good example. I think there was one of the All-State videos from last year for Texas trombone where I played like second trigger low B flat, because it was like on my way back into something else. And so there's sorts of times like that where it's like it's efficiency of motion, and then the other side of it is changing direction is going to slow you down too. So I would rather play something like there are times where I might have to play like something like maybe C, A flat, C, or maybe there's a better example, maybe like, I don't know, something like that where I could play, I could do this, but doing this is easier,
Right.
Little things like that, it's not just, what works for me is what works for everybody. It's like you have to figure out what the easiest thing for you is. But we've got a few other questions. Equipment manager says, what's your opinion on S.E. Shire's bass trombones? I think they're great. I would like one.
Yeah, me too.
So
if I had a hammer.
Yeah, so like, comment, and subscribe so we can, get Low Brass you a Shire's bass trombone. No, they're great. They're not cheap. They're made by craftsmen. Not saying that other trombones aren't. A lot of times you get what you pay for, and they're expensive, but you get you get a quality instrument for that price, and you have a lot of options. I think that we've kind of talked about a little bit on streams before that going the custom route at a certain age works, but it didn't really work for me at the time, or I guess like when I got into college, it was like, yeah, this doesn't really work for me. It's not the best instrument that I even owned, and I only owned two small bores at that time.
Mm-hmm.
But S.E. Shires are great. And then Brian says, so then there's Denson Paul Pollard with his G valve, and he sounds great. Yeah, by no means, I'm answering, or we're answering a lot of this stuff as opinions to us. By no means am I saying that, someone who does something differently is wrong or doesn't sound good because that G valve. I don't think he sounds great because of the G valve. I think he sounds great.
He do be sounding great.
Right. He sounds great because he sounds great. He would sound great on a student model trombone probably.
Sound great on a bass trumpet.
Right. He does.
He's proven that.
Yeah. Yeah. He's going to sound, and that's also an important point when talking about choosing instruments that I think people don't talk about. And I don't know if I've said this on stream, but I've definitely said it in lessons and things like that before. I'm sure Connor's heard me say it before. But I feel like there are three categories of players. There's the category that no matter what you play on, it's not going to really help you. Whether it's a $6,000 Shires or a $300 Craigslist find, you're going to basically sound the same. And then there's the category of most of us who are developing or fairly well developing or developed players where playing on the right equipment does help you. And then there's the sort of player where it's just like, it just doesn't matter. As long as it's technically a brass instrument or technically, they're going to be fine.
Right. Like you're going to sound like you no matter what.
And I think that's what we should all aspire to is like, you shouldn't need this $6,000 instrument to sound good.
Right.
You'll still use it because it's like at the end of the day, if it makes your job easier, it makes your job easier. Why wouldn't you want to do that? So I think that's just an important thing to think about that, getting a really nice instrument is a good thing. But it's not necessarily the end of the world. Equipment manager, do you have any idea where one could obtain a screw and joint for a Shire's second valve? I bet no. I bet from S.E. Shires.
Yeah, I guess.
If Elvis is still here, he probably knows exactly how you could go about getting one. But yeah, I would just. They answer their emails. I've emailed them before. Or at least I assume that that's still true. I think the person that emailed me back doesn't work there anymore, so maybe not anymore. Yeah, even if you're in Dallas, things like that you can't just, you're not going to be able to walk into your local music store and find. You're probably, there might be someone in Dallas. Houghton Horns in Keller is a Shires distributor. Does that mean they have Shires parts on hand? I don't know. You could call them. They could probably get it for you and handle talking to Shires. I personally would probably just go straight to the source and tell Shires, email them or call them and tell them exactly what you need, give them their address, give them a credit card. I bet they will take your money.
Right.
But worst case scenario, if you're in Dallas, going to Houghton Horns. But again, they might have it on hand. I don't know exactly, because they do have some repair stuff there. I've never really used their repair services, but they could have those screws on hand, but I would kind of doubt it. But what do I know? But yeah, well, I feel like that was a good, kind of devolved into just bass trombone talk, but it was good bass trombone talk.
That was cool. I learned a lot today.
Bass trombone's fun. I've been thinking about having one Chris Sharp on here at some point. We've talked about it a little bit, since he wrote a book about based around the independent bass trombone. And he's got a lot of really cool ideas. So I think we should have him on here at some point. Or maybe I could even do a regular video with him or something like that too.
Yeah,
I thought about doing something like that. But yeah, I think that's probably a good place to call it. So
it felt good.
So just a reminder, I said this at the beginning of the stream, but in case you missed it, we'll be on, let me get the dates right. Next week, we will be on Tuesday, which is the 13th. And then the following week, we'll be on Thursday, which is the 22nd.
We're jumping around.
And then we should be back on the 28th. In the first 2 weeks of August, stay tuned. We don't know yet. They might be normal, but I don't know.
Well, they're not going to be normal, but we might have normal stream things happening.
Right. I almost wonder if there's a way that, because we'll be in person together. It seems like that's almost a missed opportunity.
Absolutely not. No. There are no circumstances.
You mean we're not going to Chicago just for this Low Brass U live stream?
Yeah,
that's not the purpose of this trip. You don't want to just you don't want to hang out at Dennis Wick for a day, you don't have that built into your schedule.
That somehow it didn't make it into the itinerary.
Well,
or for this trip, it'll have to be next time.
Yeah, it just shows how much you really care about low brass instruments. Shows where your priorities are.
It does. It does show where my priorities are,
and I think they're in good places, or a good place. But anyway, yeah. So we'll call it there, and we'll see everybody next week. Same bat time, different bat day.
Different bat day.
Same bat channel. Yeah. And
right.
If you don't get that reference, I'm not going to tell you. So
you'll be all right.
Are we going to go? Do you all go to the TMEA or TEMA convention? I probably will be there this year. I don't always go because it's.
What time of year is it? That's in this early spring.
It's usually in February. I don't know if things are on track. I haven't looked up that or anything. Okay. At this point, I'm assuming that I will be there, but I don't know that for sure. I've not booked a hotel. I've not dealt with any details.
Right.
But I assume that I will be there.
I'll probably be at All Northwest or whatever they do out here. I don't even know yet. I got to figure that out.
Oh yeah, you gotta figure that out. I was also kind of thinking about going to Midwest this year.
Oh.
But I haven't looked at exactly when that is, and because that's a hard time because that's in December, and it's that's hard.
It's always the first week of winter break.
Yeah, which can be not the right time to.
Right.
It's I'm not going to sub out of a bunch of gigs to go. But
right.
If I can go early in the week or something, I'll probably do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it'd be fun.
But anyway, we'll end the stream here, and I hope everyone has a good rest of their week, and we will see you next Tuesday.
That's right. See y'all.
All right, we are